At 58, Thomas sat at his kitchen table. The brochures were spread out before him, glossy and insistent, mapping out a future of leisure that felt more like a waiting room. He picked one up, felt the slick paper, and dropped it back onto the pile. His friends met every weekend to talk about pension plans and golf scores. Their voices were low, rhythmic, and saturated with a quiet, hollow resignation. They were men waiting for the clock to run out. Society had assigned Thomas a label. It was a weight he carried through every shift at his office. Too old to risk, too old to build, too old to matter. He had spent years accepting that definition, keeping his head down and performing the role of a man whose best days were archived in the past. He looked at his hands, steady but unused, resting on the hard wood of the table. The silence of the house was absolute. It was a suffocating, predictable silence that promised nothing but more of the same. He stood up, pushed the brochures toward the edge of the table, and walked out of the room, leaving the stack behind in the fading afternoon light. The garage was a graveyard of abandoned intentions. Thomas moved through the dim space, shifting stacks of tires and crates that had gathered layers of gray dust. His goal was simple clearance, but his foot struck something heavy tucked behind a workbench. It was a box, corners crushed, sealed with brittle tape. He dragged it into the sliver of light coming from the door. He pried it open. A scent of old paper and dried ink filled the air. He pulled out a bundle of architectural sketches. They were brittle, the edges yellowed, but the lines were precise. Beneath them lay a leather-bound notebook. He opened it. His own handwriting stared back from 2 decades ago, detailing business strategies for a project that had once been his entire world before the bankruptcy shattered it. He flipped a page. The ink had faded to a ghost of its former self, yet the ambition behind the words remained sharp. A flicker of heat stirred in his chest. It was a physical sensation, a sudden tightening in his lungs that he hadn't felt in years. He didn't push it away. He sat on the cold concrete floor, ignoring the dampness seeping into his knees, and read as the sun dipped below the horizon. The morning light hit the desk, cold and steady. Thomas reached for a fresh notebook, the paper crisp and blank. He did not reach for the phone to call partners or investors who would demand the familiar, safe results he had delivered for years. He wrote for himself. He took a pen and began to map the landscape of his industry. His mind, once clouded by the fear of repeating a past bankruptcy, now functioned like a surgical tool. He looked for the friction. He looked for the gaps where processes stalled and efficiency withered. 30 years of watching others fail to fix these problems had given him a map that no one else possessed. He wrote down the failures he had observed, stripping away the corporate jargon to find the core mechanical errors. His hand moved across the page, black ink staining the white surface in long, confident strokes. He was not chasing the approval of his peers or the empty validation of a title. He was identifying a specific, niche problem that he alone understood how to bridge. The hesitation of the previous decades vanished, replaced by the rhythm of a man who finally knew exactly what he was doing and exactly why he was doing it. The transformation of his home began at 3 in the morning. While the rest of the street remained anchored in deep, quiet sleep, Thomas moved his kitchen table to the center of the room. He spread out complex supply chain maps, anchoring the corners with heavy coffee mugs. He worked in short, sharp bursts of activity. When he needed parts, he sourced them through his computer, keeping the screen brightness low to prevent the glow from escaping the window. His living room floor became a staging ground for metal components and wiring. He cleared a space on the rug, laying down a protective canvas sheet to catch the fine shavings of aluminum. He spent hours measuring tension, soldering connections, and aligning gears with a jeweler's precision. The hum of his small electric drill was dampened by a thick towel he wrapped around the motor housing. He moved with an economy of motion, wasting no time on uncertainty. By dawn, the kitchen table was a command center for logistics, and the living room had become a functional foundry. He swept the dust into a corner, wiped the table clean, and sat back, watching the first light of day hit the tools scattered across the floor. He had built a system, and for the first time in years, the house felt alive with purpose. Thomas flipped the power switch. The prototype shuddered. For a heartbeat, the gears engaged, spinning with a promising low hum. Then, the tension snapped. A sharp, metallic grind echoed through the living room as a drive belt slipped from its housing, bringing the entire assembly to a dead, silent halt. The smell of scorched rubber hung in the air. In his younger years, this moment would have signaled the end of his ambition. He would have felt the familiar weight of panic, the urge to throw the tools aside and walk away. Instead, he pulled a stool closer. He did not curse. He did not sigh. He pulled his notebook into the light and recorded the exact point of the structural collapse. He dismantled the housing piece by piece, his hands steady and rhythmic. He identified the flaw in the gear alignment, a miscalculation that had been invisible until the machine was under load. He picked up a wrench, tightened a bolt, and recalibrated the tension spring with deliberate pressure. He was not mourning a loss. He was learning the limits of the hardware. He stood up, wiped the grease from his fingers, and reached for the switch again. The failure was not a wall. It was a teacher. Saturday morning brought the ritual of the local cafe. The air was thick with the smell of dark roast and the low, droning hum of men discussing golf scores and pension dividends. Thomas sat at the corner table, his hands still bearing faint traces of machine oil beneath his fingernails. His friends gestured toward a stack of colorful retirement brochures spread across the table. One man tapped his watch, his face etched with the familiar weariness of a clock ticking towards zero. "Why bother with all that gear, Thomas?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the workshop. "Enjoy your peace while you have it. The race is over." Another leaned in, his voice dropping to a patronizing whisper. "You are pushing too hard for a man our age. Just sit back. Let the world handle itself." Thomas watched them. He saw the resignation in their slumped shoulders and the way they stared at the exit as if waiting for a signal. He tightened his grip on his coffee mug, feeling the warmth radiating against his palm. He did not argue. He did not try to explain the complexity of his supply chain maps. He simply finished his drink, stood up, and left the cafe. The silence of the street felt like an invitation. He was not waiting for the end. He was already building the next beginning. The first order arrived on a Tuesday, a single digital inquiry from a factory manager 3 states away, asking if Thomas could replicate the prototype he had posted online. He replied with a technical schematic and a quote, "By Friday, the shipment was boxed and labeled." Then came 3 more. The trickle was no longer a secret. It was a demand. Thomas cleared the living room furniture to make space for a secondary assembly station. He spent his evenings printing shipping labels and sourcing raw materials in bulk. The kitchen table, once reserved for breakfast, became a command center covered in ledgers and invoices. He tracked every unit, every bolt, and every hour of labor with the precision of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. By the 18th month, the logbook recorded a revenue stream that made his steady office paycheck look like a rounding error. He sat at his desk one evening, staring at the final tally for the quarter. The number was higher than any salary he had drawn in 30 years of corporate service. He closed the book, pushed the chair back, and listened to the hum of the workshop. The gamble had shifted. It was no longer a hobby. It was a business. The heavy sliding door of the workshop groaned open, admitting a young man with a briefcase and a look of genuine confusion. He stopped in the center of the room. Scanning the assembly lines and the rows of precisely cataloged parts, he approached Thomas, who was busy calibrating a tension gauge. The visitor gestured at the machinery, his eyes widening as he traced the path of a finished product. "You are lucky," the youth said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of frustration. "I have been trying to solve this for months. I wish I had your perspective when I started." Thomas paused. He took a rag and began wiping the thick, dark grease from his calloused knuckles. He looked at the young man, then at the failed components piled in the corner remnants of his own decades-old bankruptcy. He realized then that he had spent years mourning those losses as dead ends. He had been wrong. Those failures were the bedrock. They were the training ground that had sharpened his eyes to see the gaps everyone else ignored. He was not lucky. He was experienced. He had survived the collapse, and in the ashes, he had found the exact tools he needed to build this. The young man left, the sound of his footsteps fading into the street. Thomas remained still. He picked up a marketing brochure from his own past, a glossy, dated relic from the bankruptcy years, and dropped it into the waste bin. The heat of urgency, the desperate, clawing need to prove himself to the world that was gone. He did not miss the speed of his 20s. Youth had been a blur of reckless guesses and blind sprints. What he had now was sharper. He walked to the workbench, his movements measured, deliberate. He adjusted the calibration of his current prototype, feeling the resistance of the metal, understanding the exact pressure required to make it hold. He was not racing to reach a finish line before his time ran out. He was constructing a framework that would outlast his own tenure at this bench. Every gear he turned, every calculation he verified, served a singular, quiet purpose. He was building something that functioned, something that mattered. The legacy wasn't in the profit margins or the accolades of neighbors. It was in the precision of the work itself, a testament to decades of hard-earned clarity. He tightened the final bolt, locked the mechanism, and looked at his hands. They were steady, they were capable. He was exactly where he needed to be. Thomas pulled the heavy iron bolt into place. The click echoed in the quiet evening air, a final, definitive seal on the day's labor. He turned and stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cooling breeze brushing against his skin. A few houses down, he saw his neighbors gathered on a porch, their voices low, circling the same tired topics of pensions and waiting for the end. They looked like statues, anchored to a past they could no longer change. Thomas watched them for a moment, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. He did not envy their stillness. He did not want their peace. As he walked toward his car, his mind was already shifting gears, calculating the stress points for the new design he would start tomorrow. The blueprints were not yet drafted, but the geometry of the solution was already taking shape in his thoughts. He opened the driver's side door and slid into the seat, his hands resting on the steering wheel with purpose. The driveway lights reflected off the windshield, illuminating the path ahead. He looked at the road, then back at the workshop. 58 was not a destination. It was simply the point where the real work began. He started the engine and drove into the night, already planning the next step.